Hi, this is National Master Dan Heisman, and we're here with another video to help you improve your chess game. Today's video is going to be a little bit more like one of those podcast videos where we're not going to use a chessboard. I thought I'd talk to you today about how to read annotated chess games, how to read books, especially books. You could do it through videos or something else, but we're going to primarily talk about annotated game books. And I want to start out by saying when I first started, I read about 2,000 annotated games in my first 3 years, where I went from an unrated player up to expert. People say 2,000, that's a really lot of games. Well, it is, but it's only 2 per day. So it's not like I was reading, from morning till night every day. 2 per day. If you ask me how much time I averaged on a game, probably over those 2,000 games, I started out slower because I didn't have the board vision to read them really fast. But as I got to be a better player, I could read the games faster. So I probably averaged maybe, I don't know, depends on the author, it depends on how much text there is in the game, but I maybe averaged 20 to 25 minutes per game. When I did a test a couple years ago on how well I read a book where there wasn't a lot of notes in the game, I was reading the games at 7 minutes per game. But that's probably much faster than what my average was when I read those first 2,000. All right, anyway, why do you read these games? A lot of people say, well, game books, why would I read them? Well, first of all, I read them because they were fun. That's the main thing. Yeah, I wanted to get better at chess, but I couldn't put down the book. If you read Andy Soltis's book, Studying Chess Made Easy, he talks a lot about how different players had fun reading these game books, and that includes me as well. So I read the books because they were fun. Every time I read a game, I wanted to read the next one. I was having so much fun. I'd like to compare it to reading like little Sherlock Holmes short stories. You read the short story and you go, oh, that was really interesting. Let me read another Sherlock Holmes story. Except I could read the games even faster than it took to read a Sherlock Holmes story. So I'd finish a game and I'd say, wow, that was interesting how Capablanca made use of his 3-on-2 majority on the queen side. Or that was interesting how Alekhine tied down his opponent on the queen side and was able to quickly switch his attack to the king side. So I was learning all kinds of different things from looking at different games and different authors. Why read the game books? Well, you can learn openings, you can learn middle games, you can learn end games, you can learn principles, you can learn strategy, you can learn tactics. Game books, when they're written for instruction, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, are a great way to learn almost everything in chess. A lot of people ask me, how do I learn endgames? Or how did I learn endgames? Or how should they learn endgames? Well, you can pick up an endgame book. In the old days, people would pick up Reuben Fine's book, Basic Chess Endings. Today, we have all kinds of books like, the 100 endgames that you must know and all stuff like that. Those are what we would call exact endgames, with very few pieces on the board. But most endgames are not exact endgames. They have lots of pieces on the board. It could be a bishop and a knight and 5 pawns against a rook and a knight and 3 pawns or something like that. Those are not what Andy Soltis calls exact endgames. But in any case, I learned the most about endgames not by reading endgame books, but by reading game books, because a large percentage of the games in these instructive books got to endgames, and of course then you got to read all about the author telling you what's happening in the endgame, what's the strategy, why is one person trying for the win and the other person's trying for the draw, and so on. So these game books were a great way to learn everything, endgames, strategy, tactics. It's the whole thing poured into one. There's very few places in chess where you can get that. All right, the next thing I'd like to talk about is the different types of game books. The normal type of game book is like My 60 Memorable Games by Fisher or Karpov's Best Games. These are game books that are not written to make the reader a better player. It doesn't mean you can't get better by reading them, but that's not the purpose of the book. The main purpose of the book in My 60 Memorable Games is for Fisher and his ghost author Larry Evans to tell you what was Fisher thinking during the games, how did he feel, what if he had played a certain move, what did he expect the opponent to play, what lines did he analyze? Why did he reject certain moves? That's what he did. Now, is that instructional? Of course it is. But it's not written for instructional purposes. It's just written to give you the history of those games. Same thing with a game book like Karpov's Best Games. if you see an annotation in that book, Karpov will say, of course not, knight takes g7 because then bishop c5, rook to c8, knight to e4, and black is a little better, so I didn't want to do that. He's not trying to really teach you to be a better player. Again, could it be instructional? If you're a good player and you're reading stuff like that, can you learn more? Of course you can. Okay, but then there's game books that are written just to make you a better player. That's the whole idea of them. And usually these game books are anthologies. What's an anthology? An anthology is like a collection of games for a certain purpose, where you say, I'm going to get games that are just very instructive. Like, for instance, let's take one of the old classic ones, which is called The Most Instructive Games of Chess Ever Played by Irving Chernev. In that book, he has about 60-some games, and each game has a theme, like doubling rooks on the 7th rank, or queenside majority, or outpost knight, or fantastic pawn, or kingside attack, or whatever. Each game has a theme, and he's trying to teach you, how do you create a knight outpost? What did he do to make the square weak, and then how did he remove the defenders of the square to be able to get the knight onto there? So these are what we call instructive game anthologies. So the author is trying to collect a bunch of games for the purpose of trying to make you a better player. Now, I've written an instructive game anthology. It's called The World's Most Instructive Amateur Game Book. And what I did is since I teach amateurs for a living, I also teach experts and masters, but I teach mostly amateurs. A lot of them play very, very instructive games, which are where they make mistakes that other people could learn from. A lot of people say, I don't want to read that game book. I don't want to see beginners putting pieces on prise. And I go, you're confusing beginner with amateur. In chess, amateur means below master. So if you play in the US amateur, that means your rating is below 2200. It means you could be an expert. You could be 2100 and you're an amateur. So when I say the world's most instructive amateur game book, I don't mean people that are rated 300 who are, putting their knight where you can just take it off. These are mostly adult intermediate players whose rating is, for the most part, let's say between 1200 and 1900. And it's games by them where I picked out games where they made instructive mistakes that other people could learn from. And I put a book together like that. So therefore, that falls under the category of an instructive game anthology book. And these books are great to read because they try to take you from one level to the next. So for instance, the most basic instructive game anthology book that I know of is Logical Chess Move by Irving Chernev. If you look on the screen, I have my website where I recommend instructive game anthologies, and they're roughly in ascending order of how difficult, the level of the book, how much they expect to teach you. So Logical Chess Move by Move assumes you know pretty much nothing. One of my friends, International Master Bruce Ryan, told me he learned the most from that book of any other book when he was a beginner. Chernev starts out and he'll say E4, and then he'll take half a page explaining to you why is E4 a good move in gory detail. Now, by the end of the book, he doesn't keep doing that. If the game's E4 each game, he doesn't say the same things over and over. But the first time he says he has a game with E4, he goes into it in gory detail about what makes E4 a good move. So he basically assumes you almost know nothing. That's the only book I know of where it really assumes, it's a game book that assumes you pretty much know almost nothing. All the other game books assume you know at least a little bit of something. Now, Logical Chess Move by Move, if you give it to an engine, Chernev wrote this book, 80 years ago. And if you give that, or maybe even 70, I might be wrong. But anyway, if you give it to an engine, the engine's going to say, oh, his annotation is wrong. He said this move H3 is a bad move, but actually it's not that bad. So there are some drawbacks to doing these older books, but you could still learn a lot from them. I know that Grandmaster John Nunn was translating this book from descriptive into algebraic notation, and he saw some of these errors in the book, not just the computer errors, but things that Chernev said that maybe weren't quite what Nunn would have taught somebody. And Nunn was tempted to actually change the book, and he was criticizing the book and says, he didn't think it was as good as he thought it was. So I wrote a Novice Nook, an article I used to write about getting better at chess, and I wrote a Novice Nook about, yes, everything that Nunn said was absolutely correct. Grandmaster John Nunn's one of my chess heroes. does that mean I shouldn't recommend the book anymore? And I came to the conclusion that if I stop recommending that book, which is so unique to beginners, just because it had some problems with it, I would be throwing out the baby with the bathwater. So I came to the conclusion I would still recommend the book, but if someone said to me, gee, Irving Chernev is really, really tough about moving your pawns in front of your king. He always says it's really, really bad. Is it always that bad? The answer is no, he goes overboard, but that doesn't mean I don't want you to read the whole book if you don't know anything and you need to start with an instructive game anthology book. Okay, so we've now talked about what's the difference between instructive anthology books and regular game books. Most books are regular game books. There are some books that are like halfway in between, like the Move by Move series by the former Everyman publishing company, which is now merged. The Move by Move books are sort of in between. They're written to tell you what's going on in the game, but they also have an instructive side to them. So the books that I'm recommending here are almost all to the instructive side. There's books that are gray area that are in between that are instructive and try to tell you what's going on in the game. And then there's books that are just, as I said, Karpov's Best Games, where he's not really trying to make you a better player. If he does, it's, by osmosis, it's kind of because you read the book and you learned something, but it's not written for that purpose. Okay, now when people are reading these books, people are always asking me, how do I read these books? And there's a whole bunch of issues there. One of the questions is, how many times should I play over each game? I've seen some authors, some instructors say, play each game 3 times. The first time, play it over fairly quickly. The second time, try to guess each move. And then the third time, try to do the analysis and so on, Well, obviously, you're going to learn more from a game going over it 3 times than you would going over it once. The question is it worth it? Well, if there was only one game book in the world, or was only a very limited number of games that you could do that with, let's say there's only, 100 games that are written up all over the world that you could learn from, then you'd really want to learn an awful lot from each of the 100. But that's not true. There's almost an infinite supply. Every time you read a game book, there's 3 more published. So you're never going to read all the game books. So the number of games that you have to read is so large and the number of authors that are good authors is also fairly large, that if you read a game just once and you get to the next game and the next game and the next game and the next book and the next author, you're not going to suffer that much, because even though you learn less per unit game, you're really trying to learn more per unit time. That important idea is worth saying again. When you're studying something, whether it be chess games or whatever you're studying, you're trying to learn the most per unit time, not per unit game. So let's take an example. In economics, they have a thing called diminishing returns. So let's assume, just for the sake of argument, that every time you read a game, you learn 50% of what you didn't know from that game every time you read it. So let's say you read the same game 3 times. The first time you learn 50% of what the author is trying to teach you. The second time you learn 50% of the remaining 50%, which is 25%. And the third time it's 50% of the last 25%, which is 12.5%. If you add up 50 and 25 and 12.5, you get 87.5. So that means after you've read it 3 times, let's say it takes 20 minutes each time. In an hour, you now have absorbed 87.5% of what you're supposed to learn. But suppose instead you take each 20 minutes and you read 3 different games and you learn 50% and 50% and 50%. Well, we can't just add 50, 50, 50 and get 150%. It would be 150 out of 300%, of course. It wouldn't be 150 out of 100. But if you add up the 50 and 50 and 50, you're learning half of what you could learn in 3 different games rather than 87.5% of what you would learn in 1 game. Well, if you're only going to read 100 games in your whole life, you want the 87.5. But if you're going to read thousands and thousands of games, you want to learn the most you can per unit time. So you're actually learning more when you only read the game once and learn the 50%, even though the other 50% you don't learn as much. Now, you could argue and say, but that other 50% might be the key to me becoming a really good player, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, there's always other conditions, but if you read enough authors and enough games, you're going to get to those same 50% that you didn't learn in other games. It's not like you're never going to see another game that's going to talk about doubled rooks, or another game that's going to talk about outpost knights, or another game that's going to talk about the Grunfeld defense. You're going to see these over and over. One of the things I found when I read all these games was I could go to our chess club and I could play an opening that I'd never played in my life. So for instance, when I played Don Lotso one time, I usually like to play the King's Indian against d4, c4, and Don was a d4, c4 player. But just for the fun of it, I decided, let me play a Nimzo Indian. So I played a Nimzo Indian against Don, and I had a really good idea what to do because I had played those thousands of games, and there were lots and lots and lots of Nimzo Indians that I had seen, and I had a good idea of how to play the Nimzo Indian and what to do. And even though I had never played the Nimzo Indian, and I hadn't much studied the Nimzo Indian, I did very well, and I ended up winning a very nice, brilliant game in that particular game. So you can learn a lot, as I said, about openings that you don't normally play, and you can learn a lot about middle games, end games, everything. Which brings up another important point. Sometimes people say to me, I don't want to read a book that has openings that I don't play. Well, if all you're trying to do is learn openings, okay, that makes some sense. The problem is when you're reading these games, you're not just trying to learn openings or the strategy that comes from certain openings. You're trying to learn everything about chess. You're trying to learn strategy with different pawn structures. You can't help but get into different pawn structures when your opponent plays some irregular opening or you transpose into an opening that you don't know. If you know one opening and you study another opening, a lot of times the ideas from the one opening happen in the other opening. For instance, if you play the Sicilian and you study the open Sicilian pawn structures, then if your opponent doesn't play an open Sicilian and he plays c3 on the second move and you decide to play the e6 variation for black, you might end up getting into a French pawn structure. And if you know the French, you won't be worried about him playing c3 and you playing e6 because you're getting into a structure from another opening where you understand the ideas. But if you only study the openings that you play, then you're very narrow there. And I don't think anybody really becomes a really great player by not understanding how to play different types of pawn structures out of different openings. Doesn't mean you want to do that all at one time, but I tell my students, you're kind of tying one hand behind the back if you insist on only reading games from game books that are in openings that you could get into. I never even considered that when I was reading those couple thousand games. It was so interesting, and I love going through games in openings that I didn't play. Not only did I learn a lot, but also I considered whether I wanted to play those openings. For instance, if I was playing a Sicilian and I played a bunch of games in an opening book where someone played a French defense and I said, this is interesting, I'd like to try this idea, then maybe I would play a French defense for a while and see what I could do. So I was exposed to things that I didn't already know. So it didn't confuse me or make me any weaker. It actually made me stronger by understanding as many different things as I possibly could. Okay, so we're talking about the fact that you want to read each game once. If you say to me, but Dan, my coach says I got to read it twice and I want to do this in the first time and this in the second time, absolutely, listen to your coach, do what you want to do. I'm just giving my opinion and I'm giving my reasons for it. You're welcome to ignore with the parts of my advice that you don't like and listen to the parts that you do like. That's always going to be true, whether you're listening to me or listening to any other coach. I'm not one of those coaches that tell my students, don't listen to the other coaches, don't watch videos from the other coaches, don't read, stuff from other coaches. I tell them, no, pick everybody's brain, get as much as you can. If you get conflicting advice, we can talk about it. But it's okay. You want to hear other people's views. Not everybody has the golden key to exactly what helps you the most. Some people have something that will help you one way. Other people have things that will help you the other way. It's quite okay. All right. So one of the questions that comes up, people say, is, should I read all the sidelines in a game? And my answer was, when I read those 2,000 games, I read about 15% of the sidelines. Which ones did I read? I read the ones where it was really interesting to me, if it looked like that was an interesting sideline. If they gave a sideline which was absolutely positively necessary for me understanding why they didn't play a certain move, then I played it out. Did I always make the moves of the sideline? Did I try to visualize it? When you're playing over these game books, of course, You don't visualize the whole game. Only the top players in the world can do that. You get out a board. It doesn't have to be a physical board. It could be an electronic board, and you make the moves. But when you get to a sideline, some people use a second board. They have two boards set up, and one board has the game position, and the other board has the sideline, and then they go back to the game position. You can do that if you want. I didn't do that. I usually tried, if the sideline was short, like it was only 3 to 5 ply, then I tried to visualize the sideline without moving it on the board. A lot of times I was playing over these games with my pocket set. I'd be like, in the movie or in the TV show, The Queen's Gambit, where she would lie in bed reading MCO 9 and looking at the ceiling. I would do the same thing, except when I was reading MCO 10, which is not a game book, of course, I would get out my pocket set, and I'd use my pocket set for the openings, and I'd use my pocket set for the games, and I'd play over the games quickly on the pocket set and then reset up the pocket set. So, that's what happened in the days before we had electronic stuff. Anyway, so the question we were talking about is, do we read all the sidelines, the ones that are interesting, the ones that are necessary? I probably only read about 15%. But the most important thing is just do what's the most fun for you. If you do what's the most fun for you, you will learn the most. If you force yourself to do things that are not fun, then it won't help you that much. I give an example. I said I was reading an Alyekin game in Alyekin's Best Games, and he got to a point in the end game where his opponent made a mistake which lost the game immediately. And Alyekin said, all right, well, this is a mistake. I can now play here, and he resigned. But if he had played the correct move here, I could still win, but it would take a lot of strategy and moves, and I'm going to show you how I would have won if he had played correctly. And then he has 2 pages of analysis on how he would have won. Well, a lot of times I wasn't interested in that. Maybe it was instructive, maybe I would have learned something, but as I said, I was trying to learn the most per unit time, not per unit game. So in that case, if I said, oh, I'd rather read the next game than read all this analysis of the end game, I just said, Alex, I believe you. I believe you would have won that one. Let's get to your next game. It looks like it's going to be another interesting game to play. So I would skip it because, it just wasn't as interesting to me. And as long as I was reading things that was interesting, then I didn't want to put down the book. As soon as you tell someone, read every sideline, guess every move, do all these things that they don't want to do, then it makes it less fun for them and then they won't do it. Or it's the other way around. Maybe you tell people don't guess the moves and they say, well, it's no fun for me if I don't guess the moves. Well, then they should guess the moves because you want it to be fun. Okay, as we said, the list here that we're looking at is from my website. If you go to danheisman.com and click on More on the upper right, which is a pull-down menu, and you go to recommended book lists. It's not under recommended books. That's a different page. Recommended book lists. This is the second list on my page. And you can see it starts with Logical Chess Move by Move. Then the second book is my book, The World's Most Instructive Amateur Game Book. One of my best books for sure. Then I have Neil MacDonald's Chess, The Art of Logical Thinking. Now I have a non-anthology book, the first book of Morphy by Del Rosario. Simple Attacking Plans by Fred Wilson. A lot of my students say they like that book. The Most Instructive Games of Chess Ever Played by Chernev. A much more advanced book than Logical Chess Move by Move. Then another MacDonald book, The Art of Planning in Chess. Winning Chess Brilliancies by Sirwan. Chess Master versus Chess Amateur by Ova and Maiden. Best Lessons of a Chess Coach by Viramatri and Usebi. 50 Essential Chess Lessons by Steve Giddens. You can see I have all these different authors. Do I ever repeat an author like MacDonald or Chernev? Sure. Okay, but you want to read different authors. They all have different things they're trying to teach you, different emphasis, different points. So you want to, if you read it, a lot of my students tell me when they're playing chess, they can hear me whispering in their ear. They can hear me saying, move every piece once before you move any piece twice unless there's a tactic and all that kind of stuff. Well, but think how great it is when you can have all these great authors whispering things in your ear. And they can all whisper in, oh yes, you want in this kind of position, you want to make sure to get your rooks on the open file as fast as possible. In this kind of position, you want to make sure that you castle before you move out your queen knight because of blah, 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 and so on. You want to get all these guys whispering in your ear as best that you can. Okay, what else do we need to know? Well, not too much. As we say, the instructive anthologies, game books. I'll tell people you want to have 4 homeworks. One homework is to play lots of slow games. You can augment them with fast games to learn openings and time management and things like that. The second homework is to do lots of puzzles appropriate to your level. Start with basic tactical puzzles you do over and over again, like the 7 circles and all the woodpecker method and all that kind of stuff. And then the third homework is to read lots and lots and lots of these instructive game anthologies, as many as you can, as fast as you can. And the final homework is everything else. Read my Novice Nook columns on specific things to get better. Go to my YouTube channel with my 387 videos, like this one on how to improve. Go to watch somebody else's videos. Everything else falls into, maybe read The Art of Attack if you're a good player, or Pawn Power in chess. That's all in the fourth homework, all those other things. Okay, I hope you enjoyed today's video. I hope it was very helpful. If you enjoyed it, please tell other people about my channel. That's the best thing you can do, Dan Heisman Chess. You can also like the video. You can subscribe to the channel. We'll see you next time. Thank you. Bye.